the session.
Yeah, and I'll share my screen so that people know they're in the right place.
We are out of practice mode and we are recording.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're just gonna give folks another minute or two. I see folks are still joining, so bear with us and we'll start in a moment. Thanks. I just figured out how to see the participant panel, and I see lots of people are joining us. This is great. We're gonna start just in one more minute. All right, what do you think, Jessica? Should I kick us off here?
Keep going.
Okay, great. So welcome, everyone. Welcome to this public forum on the Oregon Energy Strategy. You should be seeing a cover slide up that will confirm whether you are in the room you expected to be in right now. And we're very glad to have you here. I'm Edith Bayer. I'm Energy Policy Team Lead here at the Oregon Department of Energy, and I'm joining Jessica Rikers, who manages the technology and policy team here at ODO, and you can see her up on the screen here too. We often refer to the Oregon Department of Energy as ODO, just spelling that out in case anybody's not familiar with the use of that acronym. So I'm going to kick us off first off with just who we are for those of you who might be less familiar with the work that we do. So we are the state's energy agency. Our mission is to help Oregonians make informed decisions and maintain a resilient and affordable energy system. We advance solutions to shape an equitable, clean energy transition, protect the environment and public health, and responsibly balance energy needs and impacts for current and future generations. So the project that we're talking about today is development of Oregon's energy strategy, and the work that we're doing on this aligns with what you see here about what we do. So it's very related to data collection, information sharing, analysis. We're also serving here as a venue for problem solving Oregon's energy challenges. For those of you less familiar with WebEx, there's a main screen that you should be seeing up on your computers showing slides, the slide deck and us. You can raise your hand. There are a couple of options at the bottom of the screen. There's an emoji icon, and you can raise your hand by clicking on the hand there. And you can also raise your hand if you click on the hand icon next to your name. There's also a chat box. You might need to click on it to have it come up. We'll be using the chat throughout today, so please feel free to type in your thoughts, your comments into that chat box, and we'll be monitoring it and we'll be surfacing what we see in there throughout the conversation. And finally, if you have any trouble, please send a chat message to Josh Price. You'll see his name up here as one of the co-hosts from ODO. You can select who your message goes to, so you can just select his name and go ahead and shoot him a message if you're having any difficulties. I also want to point out that we're going to be doing some live polling. We'll be using some software called Menti. It's really simple. We will walk you through it step by step, but I just want to give you a heads up in case your cell phone is across the room or in the other room. If you can grab it, it's probably the easiest way for you to participate through those polling activities, participate in those polling activities. And there'll be a QR code. So if you have a QR code reader, that'll be helpful too. So let's dive in. We're here to talk about Oregon's energy strategy, which we're in the process of developing. And we here at Odo are going to be mostly in listening mode. We're here to hear your reflections, priorities, and experiences around energy, and we'll be taking notes and absorbing what we hear. We have some other groups we're engaging with, including working groups. We have an advisory group for this process. We have another group where different state agencies get together to coordinate. And so together with this meeting, we have kind of a series of engagements going on to make sure that we're hearing from a lot of Oregonians with varied lived experience, professional experience. And this is really important so that we can frame up a strategy that reflects the many perspectives and realities in our state and that advances shared interests. So here's an overview of what we'll be covering today and a little bit about how we'll be going about it. It's always a little challenging to be in a virtual format like this, so we're working to be as engaging as possible given the format, which I know can feel a little bit distant. So we're going to try to bring you all in. We're going to kick it off with some background on Oregon's energy strategy, just to give you a little bit of what it is, what we're doing, what stage we are of the process right now. We're going to focus on key findings coming out of an analysis that we conducted that's serving as a foundation for policy discussions. And you can see here that those key findings fall into different topics: buildings, transportation, electricity, fuels. And after presenting key findings for each of these topics, we're going to have a discussion. And so we'll jump over to Jessica, who's going to walk you through some polling questions. We'll be checking the chat and trying to engage with you as much as possible to hear your thoughts and your reflections. And with that, I'm gonna ask you all to have your phones at the ready if you have a phone with you. And I'm gonna hand over to Jessica to take us through the first polling question so we can get familiar with who's in the room and with how this particular software works. Jessica, on to you.
Great, thanks, Edith. All right, so Josh is going to share a QR code for everybody. And if you have your phone, it's really great. Just take a snapshot of that QR code and it will take you right to the Menti poll. Or you can go to the web address that's on the left-hand side and put in that code that's at the bottom and your computer will go there. We recommend your phone, that way you can see the results as they're popping up on this screen. But if you've got multiple screens, then you could have the poll up in one place and be watching this in another. And I will move us into the poll. If you're having any problems using the Menti, send a message in the chat. The chat is located in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, a little thought bubble like you see in cartoons. Click on that and the chat will pop up and you can message everyone, or if you want to message Josh Price directly, he can help get you settled in on the Menti as he's able. So let's, Josh, throw up the map that we're going to do for this first Menti question. So we are interested in knowing where everyone is calling in from today. I can see that we've got about 38, 39 folks, keeps growing, which is great, on the line. So if you just click on the map, you can pick your county. If you want to try and land right on the spot where your town is, that's fine, but the county's perfectly fine level as well. And I see we're getting some people popping in the chat. A couple, 2 or 3 folks in Deschutes County, looks like around the Bend area. Oh, we got somebody from Harney County. That's amazing. Glad to see it. And someone looks like they're, I'm going to guess that's very South Klamath County. And let's see. Oh, we've got someone out at the coast in the Lincoln County area. And looks like a number of people in the metro area, Washington County, Multnomah County, and Clackamas County. This is great. And then at least one person in Lane County. And yeah, this is a pretty broad swath of folks in Oregon. Part of the reason that we wanted to do this was to kind of share that there's a lot of interest around energy in the state of Oregon, and where you live has a lot of ways of affecting your perspectives on what energy looks like. That you know, obviously there's things like we have a lot of energy generation resources like solar and wind that are located in the eastern part of the state. But there's a lot of transmission that runs along the gorge and down the I-5 corridor. So you might see more transmission lines if you live in those areas. And of course, transportation fuels are fairly ubiquitous across the state. So all of us are engaging in and interested in where transportation fuels are being used and available. So this is a nice broad swath of people. And this keep adding to this map even as we wrap this particular Menti question up. And we'll go back to Edith to talk a little bit more about the energy strategy and give us some context, but feel free to keep adding to that map as we move forward. Edith, back to you. Edith, we're not hearing you.
Sorry about that. I forgot to unmute. So I was just saying that I am based in Lane County in Eugene, and this was the one question where I did respond. I'm not going to respond to the others because we really want to hear from you all, but I thought I'd share where physically I'm joining you all from. So I'm going to, before I start this, I'm just going to say that we're not going to get into a lot of details of the analysis that we conducted. That's kind of the starting point for these discussions. We're going to focus on some of the key takeaways. There's a webinar that we, or there's a recording of a presentation that our consultants gave alongside with us on January 31st, where we really walk through step by step the analysis that we undertook, what it was, how we approached it, and we have some more kind of visuals showing the key takeaways. And I really encourage anybody who after this meeting is really interested in digging in and understanding a little bit more of what came out of that to go to our website and have a look. You can watch the recording, you can just click through the slides. We've also started to have a number of working group meetings, and you can also click around there, and all of our meetings that we've held have been recorded and have slides available. So there's plenty of material out there. But today I'm going to present at a relatively high level to get us into a conversation pretty quickly. So as I've mentioned, we undertook an analysis to help understand our options and how to navigate some of the risks and uncertainties for how we meet our state's energy and climate objectives. And we're going to structure our conversation today around these topics that I've mentioned here. I'm sorry, I just lost my place for a second. So I would just want to start with, what is an energy strategy? Many states have energy strategies, and they're a little bit different depending on what the challenge is that you're trying to address. So in 2022, Washington State came up with an energy strategy, and we kind of looked over at Washington and we thought, we have a lot of pretty important energy goals that we're trying to achieve across our energy sector, and we don't have a strategy that pulls all of the pieces together. And so in 2023, the legislature asked ODO to lead up development of an energy strategy for our state and to identify pathways to meeting our state's energy policy objectives, and to engage with Oregonians to discuss our options and develop some policy recommendations. And that's kind of what we're in the middle of here today. So the starting point are our state's energy goals, which include, you can see here on the bottom left, include ensuring reliability, that the energy is there, that we need when we need it, affordability, that we can all afford that energy, and meeting our greenhouse gas emission reduction goals, which apply to the whole economy, really. So here you can see kind of across all sectors on this slide. So they apply to electricity, to fuels, including gasoline, diesel, natural gas, propane, and also across all sectors. So we're talking about homes, businesses, factories, cars, trucks. In transportation, I think of trains, planes, and automobiles are all covered by the energy strategy. And so it's pretty much an everything bagel, covering all the ways that we use energy and supply and deliver that energy. So the first step in developing the energy strategy was to undertake an analysis that modeled that everything bagel and looked at our options over time, both to reduce the size of that bagel, the size of the overall energy sector, and to ensure that, I'm just going to take this analogy home, that we have healthy toppings on it, that we have that reliable, affordable, and clean energy. So the modeling starts in 2024, and a lot of work went into making sure that we're using the best available data to accurately reflect how we use energy today and how we produce and deliver that energy. And then we looked out to 2030 and every 5 years out to 2050. We considered expected changes over time to our state's population. We considered economic growth. Particularly in the near term, we factored in data centers, which we see increasing demand for electricity pretty quickly and pretty steeply. And then we looked at available technologies and costs of those technologies today and expected developments and costs of different technologies over time to understand how we meet our energy needs over this whole time period. And then we asked a series of what if questions along that pathway from 2024 to 2050. For example, we asked, what if we relied on more solar panels to meet our energy needs? What would be the effect on total cost, on total resources that we need to build, and on the overall land use footprint that we might expect to be implicated by that development? We asked other questions relating to transportation electrification, building energy efficiency and electrification. We looked at how much energy we produce in-state versus import, and how to meet reliability and how to ensure reliability of a decarbonized electricity sector. So these kind of what if questions gave us some information to help think about the implications of different pathways, and the conclusions that we'll be sharing today draw on the comparison between the different pathways that we looked at in trying to better understand how we shape our path as Oregon moving forward. And so a key conclusion of that analysis is that really across all of the scenarios, there are 4 key pillars that we need to work on at the same time to meet that challenge of reliability, affordability, and emissions reductions. And the first one here on the left, energy efficiency, is key. The cleanest energy is the energy that you don't use. It also really helps to save on cost when you're avoiding having to pay for energy. And so being as efficient as possible is a key here. And you might think of examples of energy efficiency as things like weatherizing your home with insulation or with double paned windows. Or efficient light bulbs. A second pillar is electrification. And this really goes hand in hand with energy efficiency because it takes much less energy for a lot of the new electric technologies that replace older technologies. And so, for example, it takes much less energy to move an electric car 1 mile than an internal combustion engine car of the same kind of make and size. It also takes much less energy to heat water or to heat a home with an electric heat pump than with other technologies. And so both electrification and energy efficiency really go hand in hand in helping us shrink the size of that overall everything bagel. And of course, as we electrify, the electricity is only as clean as what produces it. And so that takes me to the third pillar here, which is the importance of shifting to carbon-free sources of electricity to decarbonize the economy. And finally, we also need to shift to clean fuels or to low carbon fuels, which is what you see here on the right. So while we see electrification as a big cost saver across many areas, like the examples that I just gave of water, space heating, and cars, there are other areas where it's much harder to do. Think of aviation or shipping or some industrial sectors that rely on high heat. And so we still need to rely on fuels, and those fuels also need to become cleaner over time. The last thing that I want to point out on this slide, which is also something that we saw in our analysis, is that each pillar is dependent on what you do to the other pillars. And so if you electrify less, if you do less of that second pillar with the car up there, then you're going to need more low carbon fuels. And so you can imagine these pillars kind of toggling back and forth depending on what choices you make. And that's part of the challenge that we have in the energy strategy and part of what we we're exploring with the analysis that we undertook. So step one, as I mentioned, was to develop that analysis, and has kept us busy for many months to working with our consultants to develop that modeling and to look at our different options. And the results of that modeling analysis is really the starting point to inform step two, which is where we are today, to develop policy recommendations. So I want to just start with what an example of a policy recommendation might be for folks who work less in the policy world. So it could be a law. It could also be a recommendation to prioritize funds a certain way. For example, to ensure that low-income households can install heat pumps. It could also be a suggestion to continue or build on an existing program or requirement, and maybe to add something to it to improve it. Or it could be a suggestion to further study an area that we don't understand as well as we like to, but we've identified as really important for our transition. So those are just examples of the kinds of things that we have in mind when we talk about policy and what recommendations might look like. And so today, I think where we're primarily gonna live is this second square, which is, what do you see as opportunities or barriers when you see those key findings? And then what is Oregon already doing, and what more might we recommend? And so we're going to be really, as I said, in listening mode, hearing what you have to say and trying to really hear you and understand your perspectives to inform our thinking on all of these pieces. So as we have these discussions and as we start going through the key findings, and as Jessica tees up the Menti polls, and you think about what you might want to put in the chat, I want to encourage you to keep these key considerations in mind, which are all really important dimensions of the things that we need to keep in mind when we're thinking about the energy strategy and how to make sure that our energy sector is both decarbonizing and serving Oregonians. And so we'll be looking for your thoughts, your concerns, your insights into affordability, into jobs and the economy, on the effects on land use and natural resources, the effects of different options on environmental justice communities, on ensuring that everyone benefits and no one is disproportionately impacted by the costs of the energy transition, and ensuring that energy is available reliably. And increasingly, resilience is becoming a really important issue. So resilience might mean different things to different people, but it can be protection against wildfire smoke. It might be resilience to wildfires. It could be resilience to making sure that you can keep your house warm during a cold snap, or cool during a heat wave. So all of those things could be considered resilience. Some people talk about things like community energy as a way to produce your own energy and have your own source of energy as a resilience measure as well. So again, we're going to encourage you to paste your thoughts into the chat, and I'm going to hand it over to Jessica to lead us through some more polling questions.
Thanks, Edith. Just a reminder, if you want to put something into the chat, the way to do that, down in the bottom right corner of your WebEx screen, there's a little thought bubble. If you click on that, the chat will open up and you can type your message in and hit return, and it will send it out to everyone. That's the default. And if you're having any connection issues or problems with the Menti polls, you can change that to line and reach out to Josh or Stacy on our team, and they will help you get set up. So the next Menti poll question really revolves around, I mentioned that we all might have different perspectives on energy depending on where we're living in the state. And now I kind of just want to go through how Oregon energy is used in almost every respect of our lives, from electricity powering our appliances and devices to fuels that heat our homes and businesses. We also use fuels to underpin our industries and support the vehicles that are the backbone of our economy. So the overarching goal of the energy strategy, as Edith just talked about, is to assess different ways that we can get to our clean energy future, and to then make informed recommendations on specific options. Some of you might have very specific things that come to mind. I see people are already filling out the Menti poll, which is great. Well, some of you may not know much about it. There's no right or wrong answer here, but it gives everyone a broad understanding of the different perspectives that are on the call with us today. So go ahead and type into your into the Menti the word or words that come to mind when you think about achieving our clean energy transition. I see a lot of like focus around renewable, sustainable, clean type words, and definitely a clean energy transition will help get us there. I do love that compromise is showing up. I think one of the things that's really amazing about the energy strategy is that by looking at these different pathways, we will see what some of those compromises might look like, depending on the different choices that we make. I see somebody put development into their word for the word map here. Yep, the energy strategy found a lot of need for more development to meet our goals. So that's certainly something that could be coming. I see here, I see microgrids and offshore wind. These are sort of more future hydrogen, more future looking types of resources or technologies that could be there to get us to our future goals. I see, I don't know who wrote leader, but I love that. I think of Oregon as the small but mighty state. We have to do a lot with the limited resources that a state of our size often has. And I don't mean the government, I mean all of us. And yet we are leaders. We are showing other states that there's ways to do some of these things. And that is always a very inspiring thing to see, which I noticed that inspired was another word that I see in the mind map. It looks like challenging is getting a lot of people, a lot of responses, so is expensive. Yeah, I think it is a challenge, and part of the work that we're doing here is to highlight what the challenges are. Certainly the focus of the modeling that we did was around the expense, and it looks at the cost to the state of Oregon as a whole, our economy-wide costs. And with anything where there's new developments and new resources that need to be brought into our everyday lives, there's a cost involved with that. But we also saw that there's some potential cost benefits, potentially more jobs and economic development within the state. So another thing that the strategy looked at was sort of those trade-offs between cost and cost benefits to the state. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But it looks like we're settled, and I think this is a great list, and I hope everybody is looking at all the words here, because I think it demonstrates a pretty interesting mix of people who are joining our call today. So thank you for participating in that, and I am going to hand it back to Edith to take us on to the next item.
Great, thanks, Jessica. And I remembered to unmute myself this time, so hopefully you can hear me. Okay,
Yes.
so thanks. We're going to kick off here with transportation and key findings from that analysis modeling study that we conducted with our consultants. And this is kind of the format that we're going to be presenting these in. And there are actually briefing notes on our website that are about 6 to 8 pages long, that summarize these key takeaways in a little bit more detail. So 4 key takeaways here for transportation electrification is that first, transportation electrification reduces system-wide energy demand and the cost of decarbonization, and the pace matters. And so we looked at existing policies that we have for our state, which already set pretty ambitious trajectory for electrification. And we looked at what happens if you delay electrification, and found that it's much more expensive if you delay it, and largely because of those efficiencies that we were talking about earlier. Second, transportation electrification will significantly increase electricity demand, but EVs can provide a net benefit to the grid if managed flexibly. And I just want to elaborate on that briefly, because you may not all be familiar with what's meant here by flexibly managing your car. So for example, you can, if you have an electric vehicle, you can charge your car when you get home at 6, or you can delay charging by an hour or 2, shifting that charging time away from the peak time when everyone is coming home, turning up their heating, their AC, their ovens, their TVs. And that small shift, when many people do it, can mean that you can plug in your car when energy is cheaper and there's more space on those distribution lines in your neighborhood. And it can actually avoid investments that otherwise might be needed in that infrastructure. And over time, as you have more variable renewables like solar and wind on the system, you can also time some of that charging to align with when cheap renewable energy is available on the system. So the third key takeaway here is reducing vehicle miles traveled has a large impact on overall energy demand and therefore costs for maintaining and upgrading the electric grid. So what do we mean by reducing vehicle miles traveled? That includes things like carpooling or taking the bus or train instead of driving. It might involve biking or walking. And so this is really shifting away from driving and reducing how much driving is happening. We have a statewide goal of reducing vehicle miles traveled over time. And so that's kind of what we tested out in the modeling, in the analysis. And it shows that you really save a lot of money, which isn't surprising if you think about it. And it really is kind of a branch of energy efficiency or conservation, if that's a word that you're familiar with, because you're still getting around, you're getting to where you need to be, but using less energy to do that. And the fourth line here, low carbon fuels play a role in decarbonizing transportation across all scenarios, and that role increases as the pace of transportation electrification slows. And so as you already heard earlier on, we still rely on fuels across scenarios, and those fuels over time to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions need to shift from fossil fuels to clean fuels. And today you might already be aware that there's some ethanol in your gasoline or biodiesel in your diesel that you're fueling up with at the pump. And over time, it'll become increasingly important to focus those clean fuels in the hardest to electrify areas. And we'll need more clean fuels than we have today. And the second part of this point is if we slow down the pace of transportation electrification, we'll need even more clean fuels. And that relates back to that interaction between those four pillars. So if you slow electrification down, you're relying on something else to provide the energy. And that something else in this case are fuels, and they also need to decarbonize. And so you put more pressure on a different area to achieve the decarbonization that's needed. And what we found in our study is that's more expensive. And so it tends to be more cost effective overall to electrify wherever possible. Jessica, oh, sorry, I have one more slide here, which is just to boil that down to a few areas to keep in mind as you hear the next questions that Jessica's going to tee up. So we're talking here about light, medium, and heavy duty zero emission vehicles. I've focused mostly on electricity, but hydrogen fuel cells were something that was also kind of included in the modeling and that came out in the results. We're talking about charging and fueling infrastructure, and we're talking about vehicle miles traveled reductions. Jessica, on to you.
Thanks, Edith. So with all of that to kind of tee up this next part, we're actually going to dive into time to hear from all of you. And we're going to start with a Menti poll here in just a second that you can engage with to give us some feedback through the poll. But I also want to let you know that once we do the poll, I will start to roll it out for to see if there's any questions, and feel free to put your questions into the chat. I see Ash just threw a question in there. And also, if you raise your hand, as long as we have time, but we will have to keep moving through all the sections, we can take you off mute and you can ask your question live. So either way works. To raise your hand, if you go to the bottom of your screen, along the bottom, you'll see an emoji face, a little happy face, and next to that will be a little hand. If you click on that hand, that will raise your hand and we'll be able to see that you would like an opportunity to ask your question or to make a comment. It doesn't have to be a question. So I'm going to go ahead and just tee up this. I see everybody's in there already asking it, but just to kind of give perspective in the case you aren't familiar with the transportation electrification world, the energy strategy model found that transportation electrification is a key driver to decarbonizing our energy systems. That's what Edith was showing you. And emissions from transportation are Oregon's largest source of greenhouse gases. Not only that, but Oregonians spend a lot of money on transportation fuels, most of which exits our economy because we don't have any crude oil reserves or refineries in this state. Transportation electrification would retain more money in Oregon's economy as vehicles use the local electric grid to charge. But there are challenges and barriers to going electric. And as you can see in the survey question, we threw some challenges and barriers in that we've heard from other people, and feel free to select any of those. But you can select more than one answer. And if you don't think that there's your answer is on there, you can select other. And just a heads up for those who selected other, I would love to hear from all of you if you want to share what your other concern is. I'm more than happy to do that. So I'm looking at my list of attendees. I see one question from Ash, and I'll probably hand that to Edith to answer here. But if you want to ask a question, raise your hand and we will be happy to give you the opportunity to ask. So Edith, Ash asked, are agencies coordinating efforts to meet the goals in the energy strategy? For example, is the Portland Bureau of Transportation, or PBOT, increasing access to public transportation to meet the transportation reduction goals? And it'd be great to hear, Edith, your perspectives on that.
Thanks, Jessica. So the quick answer on the first question is that yes, we are working really hard to coordinate across agencies because it's a shared responsibility across different sectors and there are different perspectives. So we have an interagency steering group, and we've also been in touch with a number of agencies in addition to that core group that we're meeting with pretty regularly. That's largely state level agencies, but one of the things that we're also working on is to be in touch more with local governments. And one of the things that would be great to come out of this process with is a clearer idea of where we can best take advantage of kind of the knowledge and capacity that we have at state level and link up with local level government and initiatives to advance these policies. Particularly vehicle miles traveled is just one that is so reliant on decision making at local level that it's pretty fundamental to that area. So really appreciate the comment.
Thanks, Edith. I did see two comments I just wanted to mention to folks that came in through the comments, and then there's another question from Mike in the chat, which I'll throw to Edith here in a second. And under other, Charity wanted to include that there's a need to produce more electricity to accommodate power demands. So in the energy strategy model, you'll see that some of the growth in electricity demand that we see over time is there to meet those electric vehicle needs. And I'm Charity, if I misconstrue anything you're saying, feel free to raise your hand and you can clarify. But that's something we've been hearing a lot about. And then also TC mentioned in the chat mining for batteries. A lot of the minerals that are used to make batteries come from other countries and locations where perhaps their environmental standards are not the same as they are in the United States. There's concerns around child labor and just many other things that are concerning about some of the minerals that go into the battery. So I appreciate you both for adding that to the chat. And Edith, Mike Toady asks, is Oregon part, he states, Oregon is part of a regional energy system. How does the strategy address this?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. It's a really good, very accurate observation and a good question. So the model actually looked at the 11 Western states and looked at the interconnected power system in the West. And so it didn't just model kind of in 2024 demand for electricity and how that's being met in Oregon, but looked across the whole region as a starting point. And so included that point that you have in the first sentence, which is that we already are part of a regional energy system and we both import and export electricity. And when it comes to fuels, we, as Jessica said, we import most of those. The way that the strategy and the model addressed this was to take into account all of the resources around the region and their kind of profiles in terms of, particularly if it's wind or solar, kind of when they're producing energy at different kind of different times in different places. and then looked at other states' energy policies as well, because there's competition for clean resources, particularly from states like California and Washington, who also have pretty ambitious clean energy goals, and so are also kind of looking for that clean energy. And so we tried to reproduce as much as possible the reality that we're in today, and then looked at what the model kind of reached for the least cost mix of resources. And when I say least cost, it's really economy wide, so a pretty high level. And what we found was that it's a combination of in-state generation and generation from out of state that's imported that ends up being most cost effective. So there's kind of a portfolio that we continue to rely on of in-state and out-of-state resources. And we did test what happens if less resources are built in Oregon and we rely more on imports. So that might alleviate, for example, concerns over land use and natural resources in Oregon. And that's certainly possible, and it's something that could happen. It was more expensive than what we have in our reference, which is kind of the central scenario that we modeled and then compared alternatives to.
Thanks, Edith. I'm actively, I feel like I'm at NASA control right now, trying to monitor hands and chats and things like that. But I wanted to jump back in. We had a few more comments on the other category, and it was really still around batteries. So we've got both Kyle and Jacob had more concerns around the batteries, such as what the future of the battery technologies might look like and where we're sourcing the raw materials from, again, which points back to all those concerns around environmental and human rights and where we're bringing those minerals from. And also, you know, the sustainability and impact of the life cycle of batteries, battery chemistry, supply chains, et cetera. And so I just want to flag this. This is a really, these are really interesting questions. And we happen to be working on a topic for our forthcoming biennial zero emission vehicle report, which will be published in September, September 15th of this year. And there will be a topic in there that's all about the life cycle of batteries, starting from bringing the minerals out of the ground, how we process them, how we make them into components, and then looking at the backside of things. What happens when batteries are no longer able to serve their useful purpose in a vehicle, and potentially how a circular economy could be built that might help some of that. So I will just flag that for all of you. I think Hugh may throw a link to that our web page for the Biennial Zero Emission Vehicle Report in the chat in case you want to follow up on that later. But I appreciate people adding that information. And Edith, I have another question from you from oh, sorry, I have a question here. By the way, if you would prefer to not have me attribute a question to you personally, you can send me a message directly to me and let me know that, and I will just keep it anonymous. So I've got a question here. How are we addressing bridging the gaps between current technologies and the lack of needed technologies to meet current goals and laws that have prohibitions on certain fuels and the limited availability of electricity needed to meet current and near future needs? And I'll throw that into the chat just so people can see the question.
Thanks, Jessica. It'll be helpful because I feel like there were two or maybe three parts to that question.
Yes.
Okay, so I think I'll start with the last one, which is the limited availability of electricity to meet current and near future needs. And I'll just comment that one of the things that was expected, but I think is still pretty amazing when you see it, is the growth from the tech sector that's expected in the near term. So we applied the Northwest Power and Conservation Council's forecast to 2029 for data centers, and we took their kind of mid-high forecast and incorporated that into the modeling, and then projected out kind of slightly slower but continued growth from the tech sector over time. And this is a challenge. And what we found in the modeling is that in the near term, for a lot of that new load growth, we rely more on imports, on imported energy. And in the meantime, we kind of catch up on building more electricity in Oregon. But because it's such a short time period, we see an increase in imports in the near term. So that's and that's just that's an important topic that we need to have in mind over time. But it's really those data centers and not so much the electrification that drives the near term electricity need. Let's see, how are we addressing bridging gaps between current technologies and needed technologies? So I'll say that there were a range of technologies that we included, some of which are in earlier stages of development. So examples of technologies that are in earlier stages of development, but developed enough to have some cost projections that we were and our consultants were comfortable including, even though there's uncertainty, are things like enhanced geothermal, offshore wind, small modular reactors. I'll just have to say that on small modular nuclear reactors, the model included them, but they could not be cited in Oregon to align with current Oregon law. But what we see is that we start to rely on these new technologies kind of out towards 2035, 2040. And there's some time between now and then to see how those markets develop and how those costs actually play out over time. I don't know, Jessica, if you would want to add anything to that.
No, I think that covered it. And if the person who asked the question has any follow-up, throw them in a direct message to me and I'll gladly tee them up. We did get another question from Mike, and I let him know in the chat that we're going to move on so that we can get through all the things that we need to talk about, but I'm teeing it up for some future questions that I know are coming. So I think we can answer those there. So maybe we can move on to the next mentee, Josh. So we kind of talked about barriers and challenges around electric vehicles. And now I kind of want to move us into this space of what types of actions, policies, or technologies, or just general availability of things would make people feel more comfortable about electric vehicles. So I'm asking this question from the perspective of you. How do you feel about it? Or maybe you're a business owner, and as a business owner, how do you feel about purchasing an electric vehicle? Are you looking for something where you could actually have some trusted and objective information about what they really cost, what the energy savings really are, and what options there are? Or would you be more comfortable about making that decision if there were more models available? Or maybe you were looking for more used EVs. That's also something else that could happen. Do you want to talk to people who drive them and know what it's like in your community or along your routes to understand how it works for them? Or are you looking for more charging, either where you live or near your home, near your business? Do you want online calculators? We have an online calculator here at Odo that can help you calculate your fuel cost savings for different EV options compared to the car you drive today. Some people like things like that. Or are you looking for incentives to help address some of the upfront costs with the vehicle and sometimes with charging? So this mentee allows you to kind of adjust how you feel about these different things. Maybe it's something that you don't think would be wouldn't encourage you to drive an EV, and that's fine. You can put it way down on the left-hand side. Or if you think like this is the thing that will get me into an EV, then make it far on the right-hand side, or somewhere in the middle, which is probably more realistic. But what you're seeing up on the screen is sort of the overall group numbers coming together. And what I'm seeing here is access to charging where I live. And I'll flag that there are some challenges in that, especially people who live in multi-unit buildings, apartments or condominiums. There is often a lack of charging where those folks live. And that's because it's expensive to put in charging, especially when there's existing parking in place. I'll also note there's options to help address this, and there are some incentives to deal with this, but it's a big problem. Let's see what else is rising to the top here. Incentives, yeah. And the state has some incentives, but they're very popular. The last couple of years, they've run out early in the year of the program when they've been made available. They've run out pretty quickly after opening that up. And there's some federal level tax credits that are available right now as well. Let's see. I guess the next thing is seeing EV chargers near my home or business. I think this is like totally anecdotal, but I think we're starting to see more EV chargers around, but definitely places where they probably are not very common. In particular, I know in rural areas, it can be challenging to find those public EV chargers out and about in the environment. And close behind is trusted and objective information about EV options. That's sometimes hard to come by. There's a lot of information out there, and knowing what the entity is who's producing that and what they're trying to accomplish with providing that information is a concern. And more used EV availability. Yeah, definitely. Totally get that. So I'm gonna look to the chat to see if there's anybody who has questions or thoughts, other things that aren't on here that you would like to highlight. You can throw them in the chat or raise your hand and we can take you off mute. But again, we're looking at looking for things that would be encouraging to move people into an electric vehicle. I'm not seeing any hands and nothing in the chat. Maybe we got all the potential things that could encourage people to move into an EV.
I can remind folks too, Jessica, that we have an online comment portal. So if after this meeting you realize on reflection you wish you'd shared something with us, or maybe you prefer to just have some time to collect your thoughts and this is a little too on the spot for you, where we encourage you to go ahead and submit your comments through the comment portal as well. And that'll be open throughout this project, and there'll be kind of moments in time where we actually present some draft content for you to look at too. So lots of opportunities there.
Thanks, Edith. And you threw that link to the comment portal in the chat. That comment portal will be open throughout the duration of the project. So just know that at any point in time, if questions or comments come into your mind about the energy strategy, you can add to it there. I just want to add that Thor brought up more incentives for super users. So super users are gasoline super users in particular are people or businesses that drive a lot. So we know that if you move them onto an electric platform, you're going to get significant reductions in greenhouse gases, but also in most cases that we're aware of, and we've done these studies for the Biennial Zero Emission Vehicle Report, you're going to get big reductions in fuel costs as well and operational maintenance costs. And then we have a comment from Bill, higher gas prices or other sticks as opposed to carrots. And that brings up an interesting point about gasoline, which is it varies, as we all know. It was as much as $5.15 a gallon just a couple of years ago. Now it's down to more around $4 a gallon. It fluctuates, and a lot of that is really because gasoline and diesel and other crude oil fuels are a global commodity. And that means that, say, a ship that gets stuck in the middle of the Suez Canal, blocking up traffic, trying to move through there with oil, will have effects on our gas prices here in Oregon, even though we get almost no fuel coming through the Suez Canal that is used by Oregonians. So that makes it a little more challenging to manage those gasoline prices from the perspective of any regulatory authority. So EVs, on the other hand, get their power from electricity, and electricity providers often work with either the Oregon Public Utility Commission or their local governing boards in the case of like PUDs and cooperatives and municipal. They work with their governing boards to set their rates, and they have a more public process and how they are set and determined. So that's another advantage to moving into electric vehicles. And it really gets at why it costs Oregon so much less the faster we can move people onto electric vehicles. Because every dime that we spend in Oregon on gasoline and diesel pretty much leaves our state, as I mentioned earlier, whereas electricity is often homegrown. And even if we're getting that electricity from outside of the state of Oregon, the utilities that provide it to us operate here, they provide jobs here, and often they provide economic benefits to their local communities. So That's another thing that people have flagged for us that are important things to know about gasoline versus electricity. But not seeing any other comments or hands raised, I think I'll hand it back to Edith and we can move on to the next part of the energy strategy.
All right, thanks, Jessica. So I'm going to shift us to buildings now. And we're going to follow kind of the same process here. I'm going to present some key takeaways, give you some anchoring ways to kind of focus your minds as we go over to the Menti poll and have another conversation. So on buildings, 4 key takeaways. The first one here is that delayed energy efficiency and building electrification represents the highest cost of all the scenarios that were modeled. And so it really, similar to transportation, and in fact, we ran a transportation sensitivity that was even higher than this cost for energy efficiency and building electrification. But it's really clear that delaying energy efficiency and delaying building electrification is more expensive. And so it puts a little bit, it puts quite a bit of emphasis on the timing and the pace and scale at which we electrify. And again, this is largely because of the energy efficiency benefits of those electric technologies. And the second point is closely related to that, which is building electrification results in system-wide reductions in energy demand. So again, think about that everything bagel, so it shrinks the size of that everything bagel that represents our energy system and the energy demand that we need to make sure we provide energy for. The third point here, and I just want to say for a moment that when we talk about buildings, what we're talking about is kind of everything connected to the building. So everything on kind of your side of your electric meter. And so, so the first 2 points here relate to kind of what's inside your home in terms of the appliances and equipment that you're using, what you're using to heat your home, what you're using for hot water, what you're cooking with. This third point goes kind of on the outside and looks at your roof and at rooftop solar. So one of the things that I mentioned, one of the what if questions was, what if we rely more heavily on rooftop solar? And what we found is that the rooftop solar primarily comes up in Western Oregon, not that it doesn't come up in Eastern Oregon, but just in terms of number of roofs, there's more of it in Western Oregon. And that reduces the need for grid scale solar, a lot of which is being built in Eastern Oregon, where you have just more sun shining throughout the year. And so it's more cost effective at grid scale to build out there. And so there's this interesting interaction that's happening where building more rooftop solar ends up being more expensive. That scenario that we modeled ends up being more expensive, but it does alleviate some of the land use and natural resource impacts. And so this is an area where it's worth talking about kind of what the best pathway is forward for our state. And this last point, demand response programs reduce future capacity and transmission needs. So another thing that we tested kind of between scenarios with what if questions was the role of demand response. So what demand response really refers to is essentially that example that I gave of shifting when you start charging your car from 6 p.m. to an hour or two later. And so if you think about the electricity system, essentially the whole system is built for the highest possible peak. And so we build all of the wires and the generation so that, I'll just give an example, that coldest day of the year, when everyone's coming home, turning up their heat because it's really cold. And at the same time, temperatures are plunging and all of the other things that you use electricity for are turning on in homes. And that kind of represents that peak and it puts the highest stress on the system. And so if we can shift a little bit, and if a lot of households can shift a little bit in time when they're using their energy, that's really what we're talking about when we talk about demand response. And it can save a lot of money in terms of the number of how much capacity you need on the system and the investments in kind of poles and wires and substations. I'll just say it's not just cars. There are other electric end uses can be kind of used in this way. So if you think about hot water, your hot water tank at home, if you have an electric heat pump, you could preheat that hot water, have it for when you're doing dishes after dinner or when you're taking a shower. But you can heat it up ahead of time, and then you're not stressing the system at the same time that that you're hitting that peak. You're probably heating up that hot water when electricity prices are a little bit lower too, at least on the wholesale market. So just to pull this all together, because I realize that this is a lot, what are we talking about? We're really primarily talking about residential and commercial buildings. Industrial buildings are really important here too. They're really varied. There's definitely potential there too for energy efficiency and for demand response. And we're talking about the customer side of the meter. So we're talking about the rooftop where the solar PV panels might be. We're talking about inside of your house, the equipment and appliances in your house. And we're talking about anything that's plugged in from outside. So that might be your electric vehicle or even a standalone battery. Jessica, I'm going to hand it back to you with that.
Thanks, Edith. So I first want to acknowledge that Mike had a question about efficiency, but it's really pertaining to the electric grid efficiency, and that's going to be separately coming a little bit later. So Mike, don't worry, I'm not forgetting about your question. So I want to get into energy efficiency and your relationship with energy efficiency. And thinking about this, you know, as Edith just pointed out, energy efficiency helps reduce costs across the board. You know, if you don't need to make that energy, you don't have to build the generation resources for it. You don't have to transmit that energy. It really is something that Oregon sees as like the first resource that we want to go to is energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is something that like a lot of us might have different concepts about how it looks for us in our daily lives. Maybe you think of energy efficiency technology. Before I started at the Oregon Department of Energy, I would think of things like weather stripping as energy efficient, or you know, turning off all the lights in my house when they were on for no apparent reason whatsoever. So that might be one way of looking at energy efficiency, but there's other types of efficiency, things like moving to more efficient heat pumps rather than using some of the baseboard heaters and the wall heaters that many of us are familiar with, or even changing from natural gas to a heat pump is a more efficient way of producing that heat. So I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about energy efficiency in your life. And Josh, let's pull up that Menti and just kind of get a feel for what you think is the greatest barrier. So in this case, I'm going to ask you to choose, which can be a little hard sometimes, but do your best to pick the one you think is the greatest barrier to you adding more energy efficiency into your home or your business. If you're a business owner, what do you think is sort of the biggest barrier for you? And again, there's no right or wrong answer here, but it would be interesting to see how people see the barriers to this particular advantage. I see a lot of dots showing up on the cost to purchase or install energy efficient technologies, and that certainly is a fair barrier. Some of these are can be a lot of money up front. Often they will have fuel reduction costs. Most of the time that means your electricity bill is lower and could potentially pay for themselves over time. But if you're operating on a limited budget, sometimes that upfront cost is a lot to ask of someone to overcome that. Let's see there. I'm starting to see some things in item C. There are things that are more critical for my time and investments. Yeah, absolutely. When you have many things you have to take care of, maybe you've got kids at home and they need shoes and books for school and all the things that kids need, that could definitely take precedence. Maybe your car is in desperate need of having something fixed so that it will continue to operate. All of these things are definitely barriers. I am not seeing any hands raised. Does anybody want to add anything into the chat or a question about barriers that you've experienced in being more energy efficient in your life? Okay. No reason you can't add that later if something occurs to you. But let's move on to the next Menti question that we have around energy efficiency. And this gets at a specific technology. So this is going to be similar to what you did for the EV question. This is going to center around heat pumps. And I'm sorry, not going to center around heat pumps. This is still energy efficiency. I'm getting ahead of myself. So again, what are some things that would help encourage you to be able to use or add more energy efficiency to your home, to your business? You get to use that great Menti function of a sliding scale. You see that incentives to address upfront costs. That's a big one, which tracks with what we saw as the biggest barrier in the last question. Again, a lot of support for that trusted and objective information about energy efficiency options. That's getting pretty high up, but it's been surpassed by the availability of knowledgeable installers in my area. We've certainly heard that, especially in rural areas, that is a real challenge. Getting trained professionals in those areas is also a big challenge to addressing that. And this is great. I really appreciate everybody participating in this. This gives us a lot of really solid information to use when we are developing the report. So appreciate your time to do this. And I don't see any other questions in the chat. And I'm not seeing any hands raised. So I think I'll move on to the next Menti question, which I accidentally spoiled for everybody on myself, which is about heat pumps. So heat pumps, for those of you who might not be aware, heat pumps are a different way of heating and cooling a home or business. They are very energy efficient. They're a little different if you've never been around one. They're pretty quiet. They don't have a lot of air that comes flowing out of them, which is interesting, but they definitely get the job done in a lot of instances. And great, I'm seeing some people already answering. So heat pumps cost less to operate, so the amount you would pay on your electric bill is usually less than you would pay for other heating resources. And it also helps save some demand on the electric grid. They don't use as much energy. That's why they're energy efficient. So they don't have as much demand on the grid. As someone mentioned before, electric vehicles are growing demand on the grid. So things that we can do to reduce that demand are always helpful. So it looks like people have concerns about whether they could meet their heating or cooling needs. And there has been some discussion in places where it's really cold. Heat pumps might not be able to keep up. I always forget like what temperatures they operate at optimally and where they get below a certain temperature when it gets hard for them to keep up. If anybody knows that information, feel free to throw it in the chat, but it isn't in my head right now. But definitely concerned, especially if you live in some of the really cold parts of our state. I see some people who are interested in potentially buying a heat pump, and some who already have a heat pump. It'd be great if you're open to it and willing to throw into the chat what things kind of pushed you to moving toward a heat pump. And then anybody who is, I've got at least one respondent saying they'd prefer to continue to use their existing heating and cooling system. That might be really interesting to know from those folks why they're doing it. I see Thor's indicating living a low carbon lifestyle. Definitely heat pumps can help with that. I'm looking for hands up as well while I'm talking. Not seeing anything. All right, well, let's move on to the next question, which will seem somewhat familiar to you, I think. We talked about concerns. Now let's move into talking about options. Let's see here. So again, what would help you to moving toward using a heat pump, if anything? How do you feel about these different options as far as their ability to get you to use a heat pump or purchase a heat pump in your future? And again, this is just to assess sort of like where people are at with the options that would be most useful to them if this were an option to them. You see that incentives pop up again. Yeah, those always help for sure. You see that trusted and objective information about heat pumps, costs, and energy savings. Interested in adding air conditioning to my home. Yeah, so the beautiful thing about heat pumps, despite the name, is that they can do both heating and cooling. And for many people in the Pacific Northwest, houses don't come with air conditioning. And a heat pump can provide cooling in the summer as well as heating in the winter. So you get both with that technology. So I got a note from somebody privately, so I will retain their information, but they indicated that they have a heat pump. They live in Burns. They had some negative 20-degree temperatures for 2 nights, and the heat pump really struggled. They typically see heat pumps zone to minus 13 degrees, and then the efficiency of them is decreased thereafter. So real world information about using a heat pump in particularly cold Burns. Minus 20 is pretty rough. All right, well, I'm not seeing any hands or any additional comments or questions, but you can continue to add them to the chat if they occur to you. And with that, I think I'm going to throw it back to Edith to move on to our next topic.
All right, I'm gonna get this back up here. So we're moving on now to electricity. And here again, some key takeaways from the analysis that we conducted on electricity. First, the model shows significant near-term load growth in demand. And again, I've already mentioned this, but it's really striking and worth saying again that it's really these tech loads that are coming online or that are anticipated to come online over the next really five to 10 years, but even within a 5-year time frame, there's quite an increase in demand. Both in-state and out-of-state resources contribute to a least cost supply portfolio. So I feel like we got a bit at this question in having a back and forth with the question in the chat. And so we find that regardless of scenario and some of the different levers that we tested, we find that we remain part of an interconnected system, and that in-state electricity production is combined with imports from out of state, and then when we have some excess supply, we also export some of those electrons to other states as well. So we remain part of an interconnected system, relying on in and out of state resources. Oregon does not have sufficient physical transmission capacity to meet the modeled electricity flow. So essentially, as demand grows on the electricity system, we need to build more generation. And to get those electrons to where they need to go, we need more poles, more wires, more substations to deliver that electricity. And that's why there's so much emphasis on what we can do on the demand side to sort of avoid the need for these investments, because these are really big investments. But even when we do quite a lot of energy efficiency and demand response, it doesn't get us away from needing to build more generation and more poles and wires to make sure that that generation is connected up to where that electricity needs to go. And the model consistently builds more generation or generating capacity. And so we really see a growing electricity sector across all scenarios. In the near term, that growth is very strongly driven by tech loads. And out to 2050, we see transportation electrification being a really significant driver. And behind that, we see kind of electrification in other areas being a significant driver. And I think an interesting thing is that we end up with significantly lower energy demand. I just feel like it's important to distinguish here between energy demand and electricity demand. So that overall bagel shrinks, but more of the topping is electricity than it was before. So we have kind of this growth in in electricity demand and the need to build more generating capacity in Oregon. So areas to keep in mind when we're talking about electricity is, and this is partly the focus of one of our working groups focuses on electricity. And so we're talking here largely about electricity generation and storage in front of the meter. When we talked about buildings in the previous slides, we were talking about all the stuff that's connected to a building, and that's where sort of the PV panels go. So here, these insights really relate to everything that's on the other end, kind of on the system. We're talking about transmission, about poles, wires, substations, and we're talking about development needs and barriers and competing priorities. And I feel like I might want to also throw in here that we're really talking about the range of technologies that's available. So I haven't mentioned batteries, for example, but batteries are one of the things that we modeled. They're one of the things that we see utilities investing in. So it's really a range of different technologies. And I think one of the key conclusions for us is also that we want a diverse electricity system, and so diversity in those technologies is also really important as we build out our system. So with that, Jessica, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Thanks, Edith. So when we designed and developed this listening session, we really wanted to focus on ways to bring the energy strategy work to people's everyday lives. And in this one, we kind of focused on if we're talking about changes to the electric grid, what kinds of concerns might come up to everyday Oregonians, to people who own businesses in Oregon. And so the upcoming Menti question is really focused around what concerns you have as the electricity providers really start to develop more clean energy in the state to meet those goals. And, you know, the things that occur to us to throw in here that might be things that are of concern to folks are their electricity bill potentially going up to meet the costs of that development. Several people flagged that in our word cloud exercise at the beginning. We definitely heard people with concerns around the reliability of the grid, worried about potential rolling blackouts and things like that if we don't have enough resources to meet demand. Certainly building enough transmission, solar and wind are part of it, and people may have concerns about that in their communities. Wind resources are, you know, often will block the views that people are used to seeing without a big wind turbine in that view. And solar facilities can be noisy, and that may affect a local community. And transmission definitely affects a lot of people since those lines run across many, many different parts of the areas that we live in. So that's maybe a concern to some folks. Disproportionate negative effects on disadvantaged communities, including low income and rural. Here's a space where, you know, I mentioned that transmission tends to run along the gorge and up and down the I-5 corridor. So certainly communities that are in those areas would be more affected by transmission development than others. But there may be new transmission lines that go into place in places where they don't exist right now. And then effects of building transmission, solar and wind resources on the environment and the land. Part of the process to site transmission, solar and wind is to do an assessment of the environmental impacts and also for the cultural impacts. There are the original inhabitants of this area who have many artifacts that relate to their history and their people that could be affected by any kind of development, whether it's energy related or not. So I'm seeing pretty high response there for electricity bill going up. And certainly there's some of that has been going on. And while it hasn't been, we recently produced a topic in the biennial energy report where we looked at what's driving utility increases. It's not the clean energy transition, but would expect that the clean energy transition will affect utility bills in the future. Also, people worried about reliability. That's a close second. So definitely something that would be of concern in that respect. And I kind of want to tee up Mike's question from earlier here, Edith. Mike asked, how does the strategy consider potential within the system efficiency and improvements to address waste energy and losses in transmission? And I'll throw that into the chat here momentarily.
So I can answer the question with what I know, and you know, our consultants did the modeling, and there may be more in the model that I'm just don't not I'm just not aware of. But I can say that the model allowed for things like reconductoring, for example, which tend to increase the efficiencies of the of transmission lines. They tend to be higher efficiency when you put in kind of new technologies for the wires. Also, when we had an assumption in there that when a generator, so say a wind turbine, reaches the end of its useful life, it's replaced with kind of the latest and greatest technology. And so we assume that there are these improvements that we see really do happen in the real world. You know, you get improvements in your capacity factor, in the design of your turbine, in how much electricity it's producing. And so those efficiencies are built into the model as different things get replaced. Your question really goes to the to kind of generation and transmission. So I'm going to focus there, but I'll just add that we make similar assumptions in terms of technology that's inside of buildings, for example, that over time the efficiencies improve. So that's an answer just based on what I'm able to say. I'll point folks also, and maybe Hugh can drop links into the chat here, that we have a few documents that describe in a bit more detail some of the key assumptions that went into the modeling. There's also a document that describes the technical approach to the modeling. And then there are a lot of really good questions that we received over the past several months as we were kind of gearing up to do this modeling with our consultants. And so we have a comment response document that responds to a lot of those questions as well. The question that we were just asked is not one that I don't think that we were asked that question in the last round. So it's a good one. Yeah, and maybe Hugh, you can drop those links in there.
Thanks, Hugh. Thanks, Edith. I have another question here from Eric, and this one might need a little clarification. So Eric, if you are willing to come off mute, we could take you off mute, or else maybe throw some clarification into the chat. But Eric's question is, can you speak to how electricity might flow? Does it end up with the customer that provides the greatest revenue to the utility? If there's competition for capacity, I'm just wondering how that gets distributed. So Edith, do you have enough to go on, or do you have some clarifying questions for Eric?
Well, I can try to answer the way that I understand the question. And Eric, if I'm not getting at what you're looking for, then feel free to follow up either in the chat or raise your hand. But I think it's important first to just say that the electricity system, just the physics of it, requires supply and demand to be balanced at all times, pretty much perfectly. And so, the way that our modeling worked is to ensure reliability. And so we worked to make sure one of the kind of fundamental rules of the model was you must supply a reliable system. So while there are a lot of different demands coming onto the system, our modeling was meant to provide a vision of how we serve all of the demand that's coming onto the system. Utilities have an obligation to serve. And so that's another piece of the puzzle. So whether you're a data center or building a house, there are rules that determine kind of how you make sure that you get hooked up to the system. So that there's not competition for limited electrons. Rather, we build the system that we need to meet the demand that's on that system. And I think that's all I have. I'm just looking at the question to see if the other thing that's happening is there are kind of different rate designs for different customers, but I think that goes beyond your question here. You end about the customer, or you make a point about the customer that provides the greatest revenue to the utility. We have both regulated investor-owned utilities in our state, and we have consumer-owned utilities, and they have different governance structures and different structures in terms of oversight. But all utilities have rules around kind of rate design, how different customers are charged. And for larger customers, often there are negotiations around kind of how that structure is set up. I don't know, Jessica, if you want to add anything to that. But
I think that was what I was thinking Eric's question was leaning toward, but please, Eric, feel free to um, raise your hand or write in the chat if you have any clarifying follow-up. Oh, Eric's hand is raised. So, Stacy, can you help bring Eric off mute so he can follow up on his question? There you go. You should be good, Eric.
Hello?
Hello, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So thanks for letting me speak. I think you mostly answered the question. I think I was to bullet number 3, I think, on the last slide related to sort of limitations. And I hear a lot in the work that I do that, people can't get access to medium and heavy duty electric vehicle charging because of, demand from data centers. And I'm just trying to better understand where how a utility would have to balance those demands. I think what I heard from you is there's really built into these systems, guardrails on the competition. So electricity will flow to either of those uses, medium and heavy duty charging, vehicle charging, or a data center, and there's not necessarily someone putting their thumb on the scale to go one way or the other based on the revenue that the utility would generate from either application. So I guess I'm asking that question because we hear a lot about vehicle barriers to vehicle charging in the medium and heavy duty space, and so that's really, and again, they often point to other demands, and I just wondered like how competition actually makes that harder for those folks looking for medium and heavy duty charging.
Yeah, I may start, Jessica, maybe you have something to add here, because I know you look a lot at the electric vehicle space, but it is a really good point, and there can be bottlenecks to connect up new loads, and often the charging station, the amount of capacity it needs to have for medium and heavy duty vehicles is quite large, and it can be quite large for where it's located, particularly if it's in a rural area. And it might take time to be able to build out the infrastructure to supply that that charging station. And similarly for large industrial loads or a particularly large commercial load, it's not as simple as flipping a switch. Sometimes you do need to make some investments that mean there's a wait. Jessica, I don't know if you want to add anything to that or if you have any examples to throw out there, but it is a really good point, and it gets to the nuance of the challenge.
Yeah, everything Edith said, and I'll just add to it that Edith mentioned earlier the obligation to serve. My understanding is, and I'm by no means a complete expert on this, but if you contact your utility and ask to add additional load to your service, I don't think that they have the option to say no because we need to send it somewhere else. I think what they would do is say, this is our queue of things that we need to do. Here are the costs that it might mean. Like if they have to do significant upgrades to the local, your local transformer or the substation nearby because your demand sets it up over what that capacity of that equipment is. There's certainly those kinds of concerns, but yeah, I don't think that there's any prejudicial selection that they can include. But I'm not a lawyer, so don't take that as complete and totally accurate.
And I think this is one of the issues that our working group on transportation electrification in particular might get into, because this is one of the challenges that I know our team has identified, is how to get the charging infrastructure in place in a timely manner, particularly when it's if it's like a fast charger for medium heavy duty vehicles, that's like a pretty big load and much bigger probably than anything around it.
Thanks, Edith. Thanks, Eric. That was a great question. I'm not seeing any other hands raised at the moment. Oh, yes, you're quite welcome, Eric. We are happy to keep thinking more about the topic. We're all energy nerds in this group, so we can't help it. We like to think about it. So not seeing any other hands raised or questions in the chat, I think maybe we can move on to the next question, for Menti question. And this really gets into like, so there are barriers, and I think the question that Eric proposed is like one of the significant barriers that are there. So there are also some potential opportunities that exist out there. For example, the more that we can electrify things, the more Oregon has more control over its energy costs and its energy resources, so more energy independence. Obviously, the focus of this is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but as you have more clean electricity online, then there's other environmental impacts, like you don't emit a lot of electricity generation has other emissions, and there are safeguards around those emissions, but they still emit some things like oxides of nitrogen. And so you're going to reduce that by bringing online more renewable energy. Local economic development. That could mean the people that need to go and help build those solar panels or build the wind turbines or maintain, upgrade the transmission system. There could be jobs associated with that. And those jobs then, of course, support the local economy. And potential to improve local energy resilience. So, this is a nuance of what we're talking about, but you can work with your local communities and organizations. They can put in battery storage or solar coupled with battery storage that can serve to help support an emergency operations center while when there's an event where power is lost, or there's a school in Eugene where they operate a water pump so that people can come and get fresh water in case the electricity's been out for quite some time. And then obviously the clean electricity helps mitigate environmental effects. So I'm seeing that a lot of folks are indicating their degree of interest is in the mitigating environmental effects and the potential to improve local energy resilience. And I think that's so interesting. I'm not sure if we would have seen that high of a score maybe 5 years ago when we were talking about this. It's definitely become something more of interest lately. And then it looks like we've got more energy independence for Oregon, and is tied up there with reducing greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental effects. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of interest in local effects, as well as just the overarching goals of meeting our climate goals. So I'm not seeing any questions nor hands raised. Is there something missing from this list that people want to throw into the chat? And I didn't ask, but the last one, were there challenges that were not listed that you think are important to raise for the group? You can throw them into the chat. And Edith, I have a follow-up question that really kind of speaks to what we were talking about in the last discussion. So I'm going to throw that into the chat here so you can see it. But I just want to kind of give you an opportunity to maybe expand on this a little bit. With restrictions on capacity for large power users, how do we bridge the gap if fuel sources are not permitted? So I think this question is really getting at if we're limiting the kinds of fuel generation resources that we can use, coal, natural gas, how are we going to be able to meet this increasing demand that's coming from large power users, and to some extent, electric vehicles are a piece of that demand increase as well.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand the question. So I'm gonna go for it, but I'm happy for a elaboration if I'm not getting at the thing, because I'm a little unclear. So I mean, I think I'm going to interpret restrictions on capacity here as just a need for more capacity, and we're talking about electricity here, so I'm going to assume we're talking about electricity, just the need for more electrons to serve large loads. And those can be, as you said just now, Jessica, those can be kind of charging stations, and they can be large commercial industrial users. The point here about fuel sources not being permitted. So in Oregon, there's a restriction on kind of 25 megawatt or larger gas plants and constructing those. We have some pretty ambitious decarbonization goals. We don't have any coal plants, but we do have fossil fuel fired generation around the region, and over time that needs to go away to meet our goals. What our study finds, and actually what you see in other studies as well, is that wind and solar are highly competitive resources. And the challenge is really to do a few things to integrate that wind and solar because they're intermittent resources. Sorry, I'm going to step back and say our baseline is that we have a lot of hydro and that hydro is serving our system very well. And so I'm talking about the incremental additional capacity. You know, it takes time to build anything, but we found wind and solar to be very cost competitive. We find it coming online in our model. We know in our electricity working group, we're going to be talking more about some of the challenges to kind of siting and permitting and constructing those resources and making sure that we're being really conscious of land use and natural resources in that process. But I don't know that it's the restriction on fuel sources per se that's our biggest challenge. I think our biggest challenge is just to build stuff fast enough. And then with variable renewable resources, there's kind of the additional challenge of making sure that we are taking advantage of resources across the Western kind of interconnection. You want your footprint to be larger than the weather. So that you can take advantage of, if the sun isn't shining here, you can take advantage of sun in Eastern Oregon or in the desert Southwest. When wind is blowing someplace else, you can import those electrons. And that's also why there's a lot of discussion around battery storage and the role that plays, because when the sun is shining, you might have more electricity than you need, and you can store that in a battery and then deploy it over time. And so I think that it's a difficult question to answer because there are a lot of moving pieces. So if there's a piece that I haven't touched on in this, feel free to follow up, or maybe Jessica, you have a follow up in the chat there.
I got a bit of a follow up on it, and really the concern is, I think that the concern is around where there are. The state has many rules and laws that constrain some of our possibilities of future build out, including like where we are limiting the ability to build more natural gas plants in the state, and where our clean electricity rules will mean that the investor-owned utilities, Portland General Electric, Pacific Power, Idaho Power, have to continually work towards getting to pretty low emissions by 2040, very low, almost zero. So, and what if the technologies that we're kind of thinking will need to be there aren't there? And how do we build faster and get the transmission lines where they need to be when we have all of those restrictions in place? And I just kind of wanted to start first just to give sort of some background on how utilities plan for the future. When they are looking at that, they generally are looking about 20 years out to do like the full, what do we think demand's going to look like these days? And a lot of the information that went into the work that we did to build the model included sort of forecasting that was based on what utilities are seeing in the future, as well as the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, as far as new data center demand coming online. And so they're looking at that 20 years out, and they're trying to figure out what the best resources, the least cost and least risk resources there are to meet that future need. So it's not likely that something would come up where they suddenly don't have enough power to serve the needs based on the information that we have. There's also resource adequacy work that goes on to ensure that, like, looking out 5 years, do we anticipate having a loss of load? And I apologize, I have a cat who knows when I'm on public meetings and decides to get friendly then. So there's a lot of planning that goes into this, and there are oversight groups, regulatory groups that look at what these utilities are planning for, even in the consumer-owned utilities who might not be doing like generation planning, but they have to look at their distribution systems and make sure that they're able to meet that. So I just wanted to start with that picture that there's planning that goes on well in advance, and they're looking at what they see demand will look like 20 years from now and building to meet that demand. That doesn't take the challenge away. It's a big challenge, but it's something that people are actively working on and thinking about all the time. And I'll just end it with that, but I wanted to give some background on planning for electric utilities and service providers.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. And I'll also say that this is, I'm not dismissing the challenge with my comments. It is a challenge to both just meet how quickly load is growing on the system. And then we need to increase how much clean electricity we're producing in state and importing. And this is a place where the Oregon Public Utility Commission is really sitting in the center of that world, and encourage folks to go check out their dockets and because I think that they're working very hard to navigate this landscape and to keep in mind both the requirements from House Bill 2021, which covers our largest investor in utilities and electricity service suppliers, and also managing questions around affordability and reliability.
Thanks, Edith. I don't see a follow-up to that question, but I also just want to reiterate what Edith said, which is we know it's a challenge, and the utilities know it's a challenge as well. But there's a lot of efforts that go on to figuring out how to meet that challenge all the time. And the energy strategy, we hope, will be something that is another piece of information to help inform those discussions and making sure that we are able to build a grid that can meet all of this demand, but still be reliable and still be affordable for everybody. So big questions that we're all trying to address. Anyway, I appreciate the questions. So not seeing any other questions or hands raised. Maybe we could move on to the next piece of this, Edith.
Absolutely. So I'm going to share my screen again, and we're moving on now to low carbon fuels, and there'll actually be a segue here as well with the last question when I get down here to a later point. So 4 key takeaways from our focus on low carbon fuels. First, demand declines, but fuels remain a significant component of Oregon's energy system across all scenarios. And so the overall volume of fuels that's needed goes down, but the overall volume of clean fuels that's needed goes up quite a bit. And so that's something we see across scenarios. When we see something across scenarios, we feel pretty confident about it. The next point is low carbon fuels are an increasing proportion of Oregon's energy supply across all scenarios. So that I just gave it away before I read it. The third point, more capacity from low carbon fueled gas plants is needed to support the growing electric grid. And this is the one that I think relates to this last question. So one of the challenges when you have a system that's highly reliant on a lot of variable renewable resources is how to plan for that rare but inevitable day where hydro levels are low, there's extreme weather, and renewables production is also low, and so you just end up with a gap and with a reliability need. And what we found was that the model kind of reached for dispatchable gas plants burning low carbon fuel, either hydrogen or biogas of some sort, to just switch on when needed and to provide that reliability resource when needed. And that's a finding that we tested in a scenario where we couldn't build these small under 25 megawatt gas plants to comply with siting requirements in Oregon. And it ends up being more complicated and more expensive to meet our reliability needs, and I think opens up a really interesting discussion for us and for you and for our conversations in our working groups as well on how we meet that kind of last increment of capacity that's needed that can just be switched on at certain times. And then finally, electrification is more cost effective than adopting low carbon fuels in many applications. And I think it's important to bring us back there when we talk about low carbon fuels, because we absolutely need to ramp up low carbon fuel availability in our system to meet those hardest to electrify sectors and applications. But another key finding from the modeling is that as much as possible, we need to rely on electric technologies because they do end up being lower cost overall, and there's pretty significant cost differentials between those scenarios where we delay electrification in transportation or we delay electrification in buildings versus the reference scenario where we move quite aggressively in those areas. So that's a lot to unpack. Jessica's going to unpack it for us. Things to keep in mind. Opportunities for low carbon fuels in buildings, in industry and transportation. I'll just add that we're not just talking about things on wheels. We're talking about things with wings. We're talking about aviation. We see a need for low carbon fuels in shipping as well. So opening it up a little bit here. And identification of barriers and potential solutions to production and distribution of fuels. And I recognize that this gets pretty wonky and pretty far from what we've been trying to do, which is to kind of meet you all where you are in your daily life, and also build on your observations from lived experience and also from professional experience. I'm sure we have a mix here of folks with very different backgrounds, and I think fuels is one of the more challenging topics for us to get into. So I'm going to turn to you, Jessica, to help us along in the conversation. What you have for us?
Happy to. Edith and perhaps a few of you that are attending know that transportation sector holds a special place in my heart when it comes to energy. So I thought that maybe I could help tee up this conversation. And as Edith mentioned, it really is challenging to figure out how changes to fuel use in the future might directly affect the lives of Oregonians and Oregon businesses. And one of the challenges that comes from this is because in the state of Oregon, there's existing policy to, as we work to decarbonize transportation fuels, the solution for light duty vehicles, which is what most of us drive on a daily basis, is to go to electric versions. So you may see more electric versions out on the road today in the areas where you live. They're certainly becoming more prevalent. They're about 3% of our total passenger vehicle fleet right now, and they're growing. But that means that they aren't going to be using fuel in the traditional sense anymore. They're going to be using our electric power grid. And so that was why it was really hard to kind of draw the line to where fuels might be used in the lives of people who are just going about their daily work and daily activities. But there are going to need to be different fueling options for medium and heavy duty vehicles, at least for a certain period of time. And definitely for aviation. So the planes, the big planes that we fly on tend to use jet fuel. And then some of the smaller planes that you see flying around, often they use something called avgas, but both of those are fossil type fuels. Rail tends to use diesel quite a bit for almost everything that they do. Marine, it's mostly diesel fuel to drive marine. There's if you really want to get weedy with it, reach out to me and I'll talk to you about bunker fuel in marine, but that's not really important for this conversation. So those it's going to be a longer lift to be able to get those into an electric format, if ever. It's not clear right now from the data and the information that we have that all of those functions would be able to even move into an electric format by 2050. So in that case, let's look for places where we can move to a lower carbon fuel until electrification becomes an option, or because electrification won't be an option, this is the fuel for those end uses. And I failed to mention, but I think it's an important piece of this, is also process heating for industrial uses. And so we know that those are going to be hard, but how that might affect people out in the environment today would be many of the trucks that move the goods that we use, and whether that's groceries or things that we're buying for our homes or our businesses, those use diesel fuel today. And while there are options to electrify those vehicles, in some cases there aren't options today, although we expect them to be coming in the future. Or in the case of like long or heavy duty long haul freight trucks, while there may be trucks that are electric, they simply can't today meet that use case. They can't drive because there's nowhere for them to charge once they leave their home base. So, as the state moves into cleaner fuels, and there's several programs that are driving that, what might that look like in your life? So certainly that could have effects on the goods and groceries that come to us using those trucks and other vehicles to get there. Things that you purchase online and have delivered to your home, those might use planes, they might use trains, they might use automobiles, to go back to Edith's original reference. So what might that do for the cost of the things that all of us buy every day? How might that affect Oregon Industries? I mentioned that process heating for fuels, that there's not a clear answer on what that might look like in the future. But if there's an option to go to more biofuels type fueling, or to use hydrogen as a fuel, could have cost implications for those industries. What that might that mean for the economic competitiveness of our industries and business in the state? People wonder where the fuel might be created. Right now in Oregon, there's not a lot of fuel created in the state. We do generate some biodiesel. We do make some ethanol in the state. Electricity is actually the one with the biggest percentage of transportation fuel that's created in the state, but electricity is off the board for this discussion. So as we move to these other fuels, is there an opportunity for them to be made in the state? And if there is, what are the environmental implications for making them in the state? What are the economic benefits or costs for making them in the state? These are all things that come to mind as I think about how this might affect I don't like to use the term average Oregonian, but it gets really difficult to figure out different ways to say that word as the day goes on. So I'll just let out to how does that affect all of you who are listening? And so what I'd like to do, instead of having a topic teed up, I thought I'd take the last few minutes of this just to let people start to float into the chat things that they, as I was talking, occurred to them. If there's questions that they have about what I just talked about, please throw them in the chat. I'm happy to address them here. If a concern pops up, you don't have to have a question, just throw it into the chat, and we can share it or not share it if you tell me not to. And but we will be using that to help inform the work that we're doing as we move forward to building the energy strategy.
And as we wait for comments to come in, there are a couple of thoughts I had while we were doing the earlier Menti polling and getting some questions. One is that there's, we know this isn't all happening overnight. So, our modeling went out to 2050. And so the 2050 insights are really directional. And the challenge is to identify what we need in the near term to get us on that track. Understanding that there's going to be some uncertainty. And the idea is to revisit the energy strategy periodically over time so that we can course correct as we need to. But one of the additional analyses that we're conducting, and we're planning a webinar on March 13th about this, is what we call an energy wallet analysis. So we've identified 5 different household profiles across Oregon. And we're looking at the total energy bill today, which imagine you had none of the things we talked about today. So you might be heating with either electric resistance or gas or propane or wood. And then you might be, you might have a gasoline powered vehicle or 2 in your household. And then, you might have a gas stove for cooking. You might have, you have some plug loads, what we call plug loads. You plug in your television. So you have some electricity use in your home, and you have a certain energy bill. And that energy bill isn't just electricity. It's electricity, it's natural gas, it's propane, it's gasoline. And so we take that bill today, and then we look at how it would change over time as these technologies get adopted. And in some cases, depending on when they get adopted. And it gives a sense of the shift that's happening, because if we only look at the electricity bill, it's going to grow, likely, although it depends a little bit on whether you start with electric resistance heat and you get a heat pump, you might save quite a bit of money because that heat pump will be in terms of your monthly bill, because that heat pump will be more efficient. So there are a lot of it depends in there, and we won't get at all of them. But the point that we're trying to show is kind of how to conceptualize the shift over time that's happening in technology and what it means for that total household bill, so that we're not only looking at one sector, because that can be pretty misleading, particularly given the changes that we see between different areas that traditionally don't use electricity, and over time we see kind of this path of shifting to electricity. Not entirely, but in large part. So that'll be on the 13th of March, and somebody from our team maybe can drop in the link to the part of our website where you can access the information for that webinar.
Let's see this. I don't see any hands raised. Nope, I don't. Nor any questions in the chat. I just want to encourage folks. I know there's a lot that came at you today, and things may occur to you in the future. So I'm going to throw into the chat one more time the link that Hugh provided to provide comments. Our comment portal isn't just for comments, it's for questions as well. We try to answer them as best we can. That might be in a Q&A document at some point. So just be aware of that, but we do our best to try and address them in some format as we're able. And yeah, just happy to hear anything that anybody else might want to add before we end this listening session.
So I see from Eric Feely. Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah. Yep. Go for it.
It's a really good question. So I'll read it out. I'm curious about how the strategy will be used outside of the legislative recommendations. Are there additional purposes that the strategy serves? Oops, it moved because somebody added something. How are others like utilities planning to use the strategy? So the strategy is more than just legislative recommendations. And I don't know how many of these there'll be, or what they won't be legislative proposals. I can say that. Detailed legislative proposals. The strategy is really meant to get us as a state moving in a direction, kind of in the same, in a shared direction. We anticipate, as I mentioned at the start, having recommendations that go beyond just legislative recommendations. So we sort of think about 3 different buckets that the recommendations might fall into, and they might be we see the importance of continuing something that we have in place. So for example, we have a heat pump incentive program. So a recommendation might be continue the heat pump incentive program. And then we might build on that recommendation as well and say, and increase support for low-income households. So that's an example. We can also imagine having some new things, and those new things that we don't have might be to fill gaps where we see a need. And that might be legislative, but it also might be programmatic. It might be funding related. It might be related to making sure that we account for equity in how we carry out the energy transition. And then there might be areas, as I said, where we need further study. So a lot of what we're talking about on the demand side, particularly when we talk about flexibility, are things that are happening to some extent in Oregon. There are other parts of the country and the world that have a head start on us because we've been lucky enough to have be pretty flush with hydro and with electricity relative to demand for a long time, and so we're on a learning curve here. So the purpose is really for the strategy to it pulls together a statewide perspective. It's not a utility perspective. It is not just an electricity perspective. It helps understand where the best value is looking across different sectors. And so, what we hope from a utility perspective, I think different utilities might use this differently, but it does provide a perspective to step outside of just the utility territory and to see kind of from a state perspective what's needed and what the opportunities are. And hopefully that can also help inform utility processes and other processes that are out there, since again, this goes beyond just electricity. I hope that's helpful.
I think I'll just add to that, Edith. There's also a potential there for state government agencies, but also local government agencies to coordinate and collaborate more. It gives us some guideposts sort of that could be helpful in thinking through planning and how agencies can leverage each other's work. And I think it just gives us some really solid grounding foundational places to operate in as far as state agencies and local governments go.
Thanks, Jess.
I'm not seeing any other questions. We are just about at time, but I'll hang out here with Edith until 1 o'clock proper in case anything else comes up. But we really appreciate y'all hanging with us for the duration. The mighty few who stuck around to the very end. We appreciate your time very much.
All right, Jessica, it's 3 o'clock. I feel like we're sweeping up after the party.
We're the lucky ones to
Lights have been
get to
turned
clean
on.
up. Yeah.
Nice job, you guys. Well done.
Thanks.
You guys do a great impression of energy experts.
Is this still being recorded, by the way?
Yeah, it might be.
Do we have a link for a debrief? I think we do, right?
We do, yeah.
Yeah, I have to go to the climate change group meeting, but really good
Thanks,
job.
Al. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. All right, see the rest of you on the other side. Bye.
Yep.